Hello and welcome to this episode of Dr. K's Psychobabble. And in this segment, what I'm going to focus on is dreams, and specifically a little hobby that I have concerning dream interpretation. So I want to talk a little bit about dreams, a little bit about the history of how people in the past looked at dreams. Scientifically, how do we look and analyze and figure out what dreams are? And then a little bit about how I use dreams to engage people in interesting conversations about how those dreams may be helping them to understand their life a little bit better. So let's take first a little look at the history of dream interpretation. Now, there is ample evidence within the historical record that early Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Jews, Jewish nations, Christians, and moving away from the Western type thinking, traditional Chinese medicine, all of these ancient traditions had mechanisms whereby they looked at dreams as a connection between the sacred world and the secular world, and that dreams conveyed messages. There's ample evidence of this, both in secular literature and sacred literature, of dreams and the symbols and emotions and events that happen in dreams being important for the dreamer, that there's some sort of connection between them and this, say, a higher order source of information. Now, with that, science, however, has often felt, as you know, come to the conclusion that that is not what's going on. So to contrast that particular perspective, science pretty much, the field of psychology pretty much has settled on the activation synthesis theory of dreams. And what this actually means is that the brain, as an organ, is very restless. It is activated nearly all the time. So when we go to sleep, it remains active, and it's probably, as many people who study sleep, it's probably sort of piecing together the day. It's carrying on some unconscious sort of processes that are going on, organizing memories. It's an active part of our body while we're sleeping. Now, in particular, when we look at the brain waves, or those waveforms that indicate the electrical activity going on inside of the brain, we recognize different types of waveforms for all the different stages of sleep. The one in which dreams are most likely to occur is familiar almost to everybody, and that is REM sleep. REM stands for rapid eye movement, and it refers to the fact that when somebody's in REM sleep, their eyes are often moving around rapidly, hence, the very creative name, rapid eye movement, stage of sleep. An interesting thing that we see in terms of the electrical activity is, of all the stages of sleep, REM sleep looks a lot like the awake brain. It's not quite the same thing, but it looks a lot like the awake brain. So there's a lot of things going on. There are protection mechanisms within our body, such as a paralysis system that allows us to have dreams and not necessarily act them out. Those don't always work, and we end up with, people kicking in their sleep and whatnot, and people having sleepwalking incidents and whatnot. By the way, just a little hint, if somebody is sleepwalking, please wake them up. They don't know where they're going, and they're going to run into something or fall. So it is totally okay to wake them up when somebody is sleepwalking. Now, activation synthesis theory says all of that stuff that's happening in the brain, some of it random, some of it the organizational activity of the brain, actually stimulates the part of our brain that organizes things. And I want to give an example of how good the brain is at this. It's pretty When we look at random things, we see shapes that are not necessarily there. When we look at the night sky, we see the constellations. Even though those stars, and I won't get into the philosophical debate about why they were placed the way they were, but the Big Dipper is a set of stars which geometrically are very distant from each other. Some are closer to us, some are further than us. It's not on a flat plane, drawn like a dipper. We project that meaning into the vastness of chaos. And the brain is really good at that. We look up in the clouds, we see shapes in the clouds. We look in the sand, we see shapes there. There's actually even a study of how we look at things and we see faces whenever we can. In fact, there's a whole line of research that goes into the faces that cars make. When you look at a car front on, an individual will see the headlights as the eyes and the grille as the mouth, and the relative shape of that is an important marketing tool for the kind of faces, either friendly or demon-like, that an individual would be attracted to when they're buying a car. That's actually a field of study within psychology. So we have this strong tendency to see meaning where there is not necessarily any meaning. We piece together, hence the word synthesis. So we have this activation of the brain, and our automatic systems of organizing things into storylines, into images, into whatnot, gets into place, and we have dreams. This may explain for some of us, me included, the very disconcerted way in which dreams sometimes happen. I know of people who have, it's basically like a movie and it's just playing out from scene to scene, not anything like the kind of dreams I have, which seem to, I'm sitting on the beach and the next thing I know, I'm swinging from a trapeze. It just goes all over the place. Very, very, very radical and dynamic like that. And that sort of activation synthesis part really sort of makes sense in terms of how good the brain is at it and what's our lived experience at actual dreaming. However, as a person kind of looking for these kinds of things in the field of psychology, and I like a little bit stuff on the edge, I think there's probably still a good argument about the psychological value of the actual content of our dreams. So, when we think of the activation synthesis theory of dreams, we might ask ourselves, in this randomness of electrical firing in the brain, even if the activation synthesis theory is correct, and we are simply creating these images, creating these storylines, and they don't come from a source, then why do we synthesize the specific storylines, images, and whatnot that we actually experience? So one might say, let's look at this from a cultural perspective. In the West, primarily Greco-Roman history, we have the star formation that we see as the Big Dipper. And there's a mythical story behind that of a boy whose parents were thirsty. There was a drought, and he was sent out with a bucket to collect water, and he continually sacrificed his access to the water himself in order to give water to others. And as he progressed, the actual container turns to silver, and then it turns to gold, and then the container finally becomes immortal in the night sky. Now that plays really well with the psychology of the Greco-Roman world, that whole piece of Western history. Meanwhile, in North America, some Native American cultures looked up to the night sky and they looked at that same formation and they called it the bear because bears were around. They were an important part of their ecosystem, part of their economy. They hunted them. They got hunted by them, potentially. but bears were part of their culture, buckets were part of that other culture, and therefore those cultural preferences represented themselves in the imagination, and in this case, the synthesis of those disparate random dots into the shapes that align most closely with their cultural upbringing. Now let's take that a step forward and say that when we are actually constructing, when we are actively constructing the randomness of our brain firings into images and storyline, how can we avoid thinking that we might be motivated to present particular images and particular symbols and particular storylines? Maybe that processing part of our brain that is organizing information and clearly has an intellect, and if Freud is right, we might not even be aware of some of that thinking process that's going on, that it may, in some cases, want to represent our struggles in some sort of symbolic way in order to process them at a safe distance. So rather than dreaming about the thing you might be worried about, we're going to dream about something else that represents that will enable us in our dream world to be able to contend with that issue a little bit better. Now, that said, we go back to our activation synthesis theory and we say, why do we synthesize the things that we do? And we attach ourselves to the research that's come from that angle, and we see that yes, there are specific symbols, there are shared meanings of those symbols at a multicultural level, the universals of these things that have been found to repeat themselves in dreams around the world, and generally, even from the ancient world, get interpreted in the same way. I'll provide a couple examples of that before I actually show you like kind of the leading researchers of that. So it's quite, again, coming from my own perspective as a Christian, I'll use a couple Christian images that have ancient origins and how they came together to form a commonly known Christian image that we have of today. Now, since the ancient world and all the way into the present, a circle means wholeness or completeness or God or the Om. It's the completeness, the universe. There's mysteries about the circle as being infinite, the actual calculation of pi with its infinite decimal places, the actual ways, the importance of circles in understanding gravity, in understanding science and physics, all of these mysteries associated with the circle. And that symbol represents similar ideas across the world. And you look at different cultures and the different traditions of dream interpretation and dream symbolism, you see that that circle means the same sort of thing. Now, the cross, if you look at a cross as the kind of the Roman cross, which is a single piece this way and a smaller cross piece with a little bit of the up and down, the vertical piece sticking up above it. And what you have is a rudimentary figure of a human being with their arms stretched out. You know, the head's a little bit up, their arms are stretched out, and their body is down. So that symbol has for eons represented human beings. Now, in the modernized, as history has come along, we see those two images coming together within the Judeo-Christian traditions to portray Jesus on a cross with a halo. That halo representing God, the cross representing man, and Jesus in the tradition of Christianity, meaning God who became man. He's one in both. So this symbol of a circle, meaning God, and the cross, meaning man, is the unity of God and man as represented within the Christian tradition. I say all this because those symbols which predate Christianity have always meant wholeness, God, completeness, the universe, and the cross has meant humanity, mankind, people, those kinds of things. And then our imaginations bring them together, and they have even more meaning for someone, certainly great meaning for individuals who are of the Christian tradition. Now, throughout the years, different people have put together catalogs of images and storylines and whatnot that you may encounter in dreams and their relative interpretations to them. Now, each one of those cultures that I said at the beginning of this lecture all have codices. They all have books. They all have representations of what different things mean inside of dreams. Now, if we're going to look at this in a more modern way, we're going to have to bring in some experts in the field of psychology. And the individuals that brought this very mystical, very tradition-based ideas of symbols within dreams into the world of science. And now some scientists don't think this is very scientific, but they certainly examined it using scientific eyes, and these two individuals were very clearly very important scientists, and those individuals were Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. Now, Sigmund Freud, we all know. Carl Jung, you might know. Sigmund Freud is famous for his invention of psychoanalysis, but he was also incredibly well read in the ancient texts. He understood mythology very, very deeply and felt very much that the myths represented in ancient cultures were actual psychological concepts that would be represented in there. We have those today when we think of the Oedipus complex, which he came up with. Oedipus is an individual who ends up in the great story from the ancient world. He ends up killing his father and marrying his mother. And this, to Freud, was a story that represented what he felt was an inner attraction to the mother figure in somebody's life and a rejection of the father figure as an individual who was in competition for the attention of the mom. Now, maturity is the realization that that's not to be, and what Freud referred to as the separation, individuation of the ego from that bond between mom and being able to then live on their own and then bond with another woman in this case. And hence the kind of philosophies that we have that are not necessarily accurate, but men will seek somebody that's like their mom. That comes from that whole dynamic. But my point being is that Freud took from the ancient world these symbolic stories. And with that mindset, he adopted the notion that we may find ourselves constructing similar stories within our dreams. Now, in Freud's personality theory, and you may have encountered that, it's often represented as in a pictorial format, and you have an iceberg that's sitting in the water, and most of the iceberg is below the water, and this symbolizes that most of our personality is below our consciousness. We're not really aware of it. The ego is what's visible. And then we have the id, which is the deep self-serving part of our personality. And then the superego, which is the learned mechanisms of what is right and wrong in terms of our behavior. And our ego is sitting literally with the id on one shoulder and the superego on the other shoulder, portrayed in cinema with the angel and the devil. So you have the id is saying, go ahead and take it, and the superego is saying, no, don't take that. And you're the ego trying to figure out what's the best thing to do. Now, with conflict between those unsatisfied conflict, when people got into trouble and they came to Freud, he felt that some of the talking that's going on underneath the waves bubbled up to the top in dreams. That wasn't his only tool. He also used a tool called free association, where people just kind of, that's that representation we see where somebody's laying on the couch and Freud is, writing notes on him. That particular methodology was free association, and he felt that was also another way to capture these inner ideas and conflicts. People would have slips of the tongue, all of those things, all coming from that rich world of Sigmund Freud. But in terms of dreams, he felt if people told him their dreams, he would be able to interpret them using the symbols in them and feeling that those symbols represented inner conflicts that individual needed to focus on in order to move on. Now, Carl Jung was a student of Freud. He was actually, to tell you the truth, he was Sigmund Freud's prodigal son. He was, I'm not sure if that's prodigal or prodigy, something like that. He was the one. Freud wanted Carl Jung to replace him. He was the next leader of this movement in psychoanalysis, and was crushed emotionally when Carl Jung felt that he needed to depart from his mentor and go at his own. But Carl Jung, actually, in this model of the personality, I want to imagine that iceberg floating in the sea, Carl Jung focused his work on the sea. What's in the ocean? You hear of this personality floating in the ocean, and the id, the ego, and the superego interacting largely beyond our conscious awareness. Carl Jung took a look at this and said, well, what's in the ocean? And because all of us are floating in the same ocean, it's a shared ocean or a collective ocean. He referred to that water in which we are all in, all our little icebergs floating in the ocean, that he called the collective unconscious. Now, the collective unconscious was not only a mechanism that buoyed us up in the spiritual world and kept our ego above the waters, but it was also a way of communicating. That he felt that even though we may be physically apart by thousands of miles, we are unified by being in this part of this collective unconscious, and we can, at the spiritual level, communicate and arrange for things to happen on the world at that subconscious level. And this was a mechanism that he referred to as synchronicity. Synchronicity, he felt, was what explained when people met their soulmate. And it was just happenstance, just what is the likelihood that I would have run into this person, or any sort of chance encounter that we had. Carl Jung would sit back and say, no, that was arranged by aspects of yourself below your consciousness who have access to other people's below consciousness intelligences. So it's all being worked out at that unconscious level. At the same time, we have Carl Jung looking at, are there any, what I like to call them, creatures swimming around in the ocean? And that is what Carl Jung focused on in terms of his own dream analysis. That he would look at these same symbols, and he felt, going back to what I said about circles and crosses, he felt that the reason why the circle in all cultures has always meant the world, the universe, God, and crosses have always meant humanity, people, person, kind of thing, is because those are symbols that exist within the ocean. They're the shared language of the unconscious mind. And he cataloged these using dream analysis from around the world, different cultures, and he cataloged what different things mean. And of course, others have carried on from that point. So Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung published works that were seminal in creating a field of dream interpretation within the modern world based on the combined efforts of both of these perspectives. And so Freud published The Interpretation of Dreams, and Carl Jung published a multi-volume set of books called Dreams, where he explored the symbolism within dreams and what they mean, which ones are from a collective point of view, and which ones are our own creation. So that brings me to the modern day. So as I was becoming a psychologist and learning about these things, I became fascinated with dreams, my own dreams. I joined the Jungian Society that was in Brunswick, Maine at that time, attended some of their meetings, and there was a lot of individuals there that were into dream interpretation, had taught themselves to remember their dreams. They could remember multiple dreams. There's a whole procedure. They actually had it as a handout, how to create a situation in your own life where you remember your dreams. It has to do with keeping a journal right next to your bed, and just every time you wake up, you go right for that journal and you write down what you can remember. And over time, the individuals that I encountered in that particular group could in detail remember not only the dream they had, but each dream that they had throughout the night. Now, my interest in this was also as a psychologist of engaging people in conversations. And when you're working with someone who may be struggling with an issue, sometimes the straightforward attack mode is really uncomfortable. Issues that they have might be very uncomfortable to talk about, or they may feel that things that are going on in other parts of life are not as important as the things that they're coming to counseling for. And I often found that to be the case when I encouraged someone to tell me about their dreams, and I went through the process that I'm about to tell you. Now, personally, I kind of buy into this a little bit. It's a useful tool. I kind of buy into the idea of a collective unconscious, that we share connections with others and synchronicity and some of that depth psychology that's going on. But I approach dream interpretation from a very, very pragmatic level. So let's take a look at what I do when I'm doing dream interpretation. For one, I use a dream dictionary. And the best one that I've found is this actual edition. I'm not even sure if it's in print anymore. It's the New American Dream Dictionary. It was published, let me see here. I have my copy right here. This one came out 2006, this particular edition. And this reads just like a dictionary. Here's the real one. And it looks just like a dictionary. You look up words. I'm going to look up one here, just random one. Path. So if you're having a dream and there's a path, you're walking along a path, or you see a path, or somebody's talking about a path or something, you can talk about one interpretation of that is destiny, one is progress, another one is peaceful state of mind. If the path is not blocked. If it's blocked, then we have to probably look up blocked, right? And see what that has to do with path. And maybe our destiny or our progress is being blocked. What it's being blocked by? A bear. Let's look up bear. Let's say I dream that I'm walking in the woods along a path, which according to this is representing my progress in life, and there's a bear that is blocking my path. So I look up bear, and the bear means strong but gentle in nature, a leader, especially military, a warrior, out of control, unconscious element, usually dangerous to become berserk or transformation. And then at this point I would wonder, along my way, are there any individuals in my life, maybe authority figures, that are actually in my way? So maybe I have this path to go take a course someplace, but important people that I respect are saying, no, don't do that. So I start connecting my dream to reality, and then I further in the dream, okay, a bird comes down and lands on the bear. Okay, so I look up bird. I'm making this up as we go here. So I look up bird, and it has freedom, freedom of spirit, imagination, prosperity, elevation of status, domestic security, transcending adversity, blah, blah. And then, I start thinking, well, I'm along this path. It's a little different. Authority figures are standing in front of me. People I respect are blocking that path. The bird comes along and reminds me that the path may be leading me away from domestic security. That their point to me that, you see where I'm going? That this is, that I engage an individual in a conversation about their dream. I look up and suggest different meanings to them about what that could mean, and we connect it to real things in their lives. And so let's just say after that little segment that I've done of dream interpretation, say this was real, the individual is then able to say, okay, this dream is representing that I'm along this path, this progress path, and I know what that means because, I have this plan that I'm working on. I know what the bear is. I know the bear is my father. And my father's telling me I shouldn't do this. And the bird is reminding me that connecting that is that my father doesn't want me to do this because it's going to put the stability of my household at risk. My dream is telling me I need to think about this. At that point, we may depart from the dream. In the therapy session, we may depart from the dream and start talking about this plan, this risk that they're taking. What do they feel? What's the valid point from their father, represented by the bear? Are they really not looking at all the different options? And that it engages this conversation. So, in that light, I encounter an individual and I ask them to tell me the storyline of the dream. I look up specific elements in the dictionary exactly the way I just did in this example. I pay special attention to emotions. I didn't play that out here, but I might say, I might ask, well, is the bear showing any emotions? And maybe the bear is just, well, the bear looks sad if that information is there. And I might ask the individual, are you scared? And they might say, no. Now, if I was really in the woods walking along a path and a bear with a bird on top of it blocked my path, I might be worried. But if you're not scared, then what is the emotion that's going on? And we would examine that as another element of that particular dream. I would suggest different meanings, and then that would lead to making connections, and then ultimately to a conversation. And to me, this is where the value of dream interpretation comes in. We move from an individual coming in going, let's just talk about things, to using a dream as a platform for developing some insight into a real situation that's going on using the symbolism that's in the dream. Now, I'll tell you, this doesn't always work. It takes a while. I've been doing this for a couple decades, and so I've got to know, not this particular book, obviously, this is from almost 2 decades, but the using dictionaries and using this one for almost, I've had this since 2006. I knew I bought it brand new. And using this and trying to piece together, you'll see how I selected a particular interpretation of bird that seemed to be more relevant to maybe what's going on. Now, if that resonates with the person that I'm talking to, great. If it doesn't, I move on. I don't have to be right. We can reinterpret this whole thing. The point is to get to a conversation between me and the client that is based on real stuff. After we've interpreted that dream, we can have a conversation for however long we want about this new path that they're on that involves some risk and the fact that their father doesn't want them to do it because it's going to provide some risk to the stability of their family. That's what we start talking about. We leave the dream behind. So that is the way I personally approach dream interpretation. I like doing it. I don't really charge a lot. We can do it over Facebook. You want to get, we can do it over video and all that stuff. I'd be glad to take people on and help them understand their dreams in that way. Not a very scary process. And I enjoy doing that. It makes for a platform of communication that is sort of safe. I tell individuals, you're not responsible for the content of your dreams. That you are, I know that, but we're going to explore them in a way as, this is mechanisms within your unconscious that are just kind of nudging you to maybe think things more clearly. So that's how I approach those things. I hope you enjoyed this particular episode of Dr. K's Psychobabble. Wow, couldn't even get my own name right there. Please subscribe and click the little bell, I don't even know where that is, but click the bell that enables you to get informed when there's a new video out. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you later.